Thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you today, and the first two speakers are going to be a tough act to follow, as they say, so see what I can do. Can you hear me at the back?
Thank you.
Sorry. Oh, thank you. Yep. So I'm going to talk about major event management at an LPG facility in Tasmania, LPG being liquefied petroleum gas, the stuff that you find in your cylinders at barbecues and so forth. I'm going to try and get to what I think are the key ingredients for successful preparation and planning and response to a major emergency event. Now, some of it I think is probably stuff you'll think is fairly basic and obvious, but it's actually amazing how easily you can overlook or get wrong some of the basics in this kind of topic. So I'm going to try and focus on three key areas. One is what are the major emergency event scenarios, and this is very much from an LPG, process safety, major hazard kind of area. So I can understand and appreciate there might be a lot of what I'm talking about that's not obviously applicable and relevant to some of the industries that you guys work in. I'm sure you come from a variety of backgrounds, but I think there's actually a lot more common and of value to a broader range of industries than purely process safety and in my processing industry. So what are the major emergency type scenarios that you need to plan for? What are the procedures that you need to have and the plans? That's the obvious sort of documentation, but what makes a good emergency response plan? And thirdly, how do you make all those documents actually meaningful and effective in practice when the proverbial brown stuff hits the fan? So, just a little bit about Origin LPG and the Hobart terminal, which is quite close by to here. Origin LPG serves 250,000 customers in Australia, so we have a lot of both industrial and residential consumers across the whole of Australia. 230,000 tonnes per year of LPG being used in the Australian market, and that's 29% of the total market. So the LPG industry is really quite big and certainly very widespread. We have 42 large LPG storage and distribution terminals around Australia, quite a few more in the Asia-Pacific region. And what I'm not accounting for there is the vast number of customer installations that we have that receive and use our product in homes and in industrial facilities. So there are literally thousands of those which also store and use LPG. Of those 42, we have 11 so-called MHFs, major hazard facilities, which are specifically regulated under the work health and safety regs in Tasmania and New South Wales and Queensland and other places, and similarly in Victoria under the occupational health and safety regulations. And I think in WA it's under dangerous goods. But they're all basically the larger of the facilities. In the case of LPG, you need to have 200 tonnes of the stuff to qualify as a major hazard facility, and what it means is you really get a lot more regulatory attention, and quite rightly so. That scale of operation, that scale of risk needs particular attention. We also have a very substantial logistics fleet of both bulk tankers and cylinder trucks that convey our product to our end users, and they are effectively mobile process safety hazards that go around the roads of Australia. Now, looking at Hobart Terminal in particular, it's an LPG ship import operation, so we have LPG coming in. Trent is actually the terminal manager for Hobart, so he knows more than I do about this place. But it's basically, how many ships a year do you get roughly?
Around 12.
So about 12 ships a year. We'll import large quantities of LPG at about, I think it's 130 tonnes per hour.
Yeah,
So a fairly high flow rate into our very large storage tanks. We have, how many storage tanks do we have?
10 in total.
10 in total. I'm looking at the whole of Australia, so I forget the numbers for individual terminals very easily. So 10 large storage tanks and a fairly large total amount of LPG stored, way in excess of the 200-ton MHF threshold. And then bulk and packaged LPG transfer and export through cylinders and bulk road tankers. So pretty busy place. The obvious things as well on the site: admin offices, workshops, warehousing and that kind of thing, stores, truck and vehicle parking, that kind of thing. So it's most definitely a major hazard facility under the work health and safety regs. So on to the main topic. Now, major emergency scenarios. For an LPG installation, it's pretty blindingly obvious that the main risk is, of course, a loss of containment of LPG. It's a highly flammable material. It vaporizes very rapidly from its liquefied storage conditions under ambient temperature, because it would normally only be a liquid at minus 42 centigrade, I think it is. So it rapidly flashes and creates a large vapor cloud. So if you release large quantities of it, you certainly have a hazardous situation on your hands. So a lot of our emergency scenarios are to do with those types of loss of containment events, process safety. So leak, fire and explosion type scenarios. But there's obviously other things as well that could create a major emergency scenario for our facility. So things like vehicle incidents on site or off site, anywhere to and from or at the customer installations. Remember I said those tankers and cylinder trucks effectively represent a process safety hazard that's mobile along the roads. A security incident, so we're all aware increasingly of the kind of issues that security raises, and we get quite a lot of attention on that topic because we're, you know, a major hazard facility, and those are potential targets for a number of reasons. Medical emergencies, so it could be one person or it could be a number of people who are affected by some form of medical emergency, whether that's a health-related issue, a collapse or incapacitation event due to some condition, or whether it's actually an industrial incident-related situation, but it's creating a medical emergency on the site. We have various hazardous chemicals as well as LPG, so ethyl mercaptan, that's the stuff that we inject into our LPG so you can smell it if it leaks. Extremely distressing thing to breathe in large quantities, and can actually lead to the evacuation of entire towns when it's been released in relatively small quantities, so it's very, very smelly. Diesel, spills of that obviously can create a risk. Natural disasters, so we have facilities all around Australia, and as we all are aware, that, you know, the range of natural disasters that can affect our country, and our facilities are no exception. So we have things like cyclone plans and other types of response plan for natural disasters. And then fire or an emergency in the surrounding area. So we typically have industrial neighbours, or we might have residential neighbours in some cases, but there are basically threats from outside that could impact on our facilities. And in the case of our terminals that are ship import terminals like Hobart, they tend to be inside a port area where there's multiple range of operators, and we're all part of a port emergency response environment as well. So we fall under the port emergency response arrangements as well as our own. And then finally, an incident at the customer site. So we're very systematic, tediously so, in defining all of our emergency scenarios that our response plans need to address. And it's important to really be clear about what are those emergency scenarios and how are you going to respond to each one of them. So I've put in red the key ingredients in each slide of what I think is the key to success, if you like. So you've got to cover a range of scenarios. So it is actually quite difficult to get people to really think outside the box and really understand what are the worst case scenarios. We tend to sort of look at lesser scenarios because they're more common, more well known. But you really, in order to do this subject justice, you have to be prepared to expect and plan for the worst. And that can be quite a lot worse than what people have actually experienced in their own lives. So you've got to be prepared to think of things that are pretty much unthinkable. Your risk assessments that you do, no doubt, will be one of the things that you can look at to inform that process. You've got to be prepared to cover a wide range of circumstances. So an emergency in one set of circumstances might be relatively straightforward, but you change a few factors and it becomes then an awful lot more difficult. So how would you respond to an emergency when you've actually got nobody on the site at all, or you've got nighttime conditions, or you've got a large number of visitors who happen to be there at the same time, or a whole variety of things can change and circumstances that can conspire to make an emergency that's bad even worse and quite a difficult thing to address. So you've got to be prepared to define the range of circumstances. Being realistic about timing. It's amazing how we can readily hope that the cavalry will come in the space of a few minutes and set up their response procedures very rapidly, when the reality is quite different. It might take quite a bit of time to get there, to understand what's going on, just to communicate the basics and actually start taking response actions. So being realistic about emergency response, timing and other things is important. And then understanding the consequences of these scenarios. So if you take a look at that top right corner, it's probably not very legible, I apologise for that, but that's basically a hazard zone for one of the worst case disaster scenarios in the LPG industry, and that's a BLEVE. Has anyone heard of a BLEVE? Very techie term. It stands for Boiling Liquid Expanding Vapour Explosion. And it's what happens if you release a large quantity of any material above its normal boiling point at atmospheric pressure. It basically rapidly vaporizes, and if you set fire to it, if LPG for example, at the same time, then you've got a fireball scenario. And that's pretty much our worst case in most situations. There have been two major BLEVE events in our industry if you go back enough years in Australia. So a lot of our engineering design and our operating systems have been evolved over the years to try and prevent those things from ever happening, but we still recognise the risk is there and we have to plan for the worst if one of these BLEVEs were to happen today. So the hazard zone can actually be quite alarmingly large from a BLEVE, and this zone is really a product of a computer analysis of how much radiation you get out of a BLEVE scenario, and it's showing circles around the site of decreasing levels of thermal radiation. And the outer one, I think, if I read that, is injury risk. The inner one, the purple zone, is the fireball itself. So probably half the way through there, you've got an orange contour, which is 1% chance of fatality. So we can, if we have one of these events, have very substantial consequences to both our operators on site and to neighbouring populations. So what I'm trying to get at here is have a very clear understanding of what your consequences could be in the event of an emergency. And the consequences could be way beyond safety and health, so understanding what else could occur as a result, what environmental impact are we talking about, impact on property, our own and other people's, and impact on businesses, businesses having to close, and the impacts on the community as a whole. So back to some of the points that were made earlier about the wider complete picture of impacts from these scenarios. Reputation, of course, is key to all of us, and that's another impact. So on to the plans and procedures. So we have, as I say, a lot of terminals. Each terminal has its own emergency response procedure, and that's really just the sort of starting point, if you like. That's the document that says, well, how are we going to deal with these things? What can go wrong, and how do we respond? We have a heap of corporate standards, as you'd expect in Origin. I'm sure you guys all have those as well. And we build our ERPs to address those corporate expectations, but also regulatory ones and industry practice. So in our industry, in the process industry, for, say, I don't know, the last 40 or 50 years, we've had a huge amount of experience the hard way on managing emergency events. And we have, as an industry as a whole, a great deal of expertise in how to deal with these situations. So first thing is to be clear on your ER philosophy, your emergency response philosophy, and ours is very simple. It's about preservation of life as our number one priority, and that really then dictates everything else. Everything else flows from that basic philosophy, so be clear about that. We have a lot of discussion with our regulators across Australia in the various jurisdictions in which we work on our ERPs. They're very interested in those, and we also share them with our emergency services colleagues, and so they review extensively everything that we are committing to in paper, and expect us to follow through on that in terms of training and exercises and so forth. So a great deal of dialogue between us, the operator, and the regulators in emergency services. That is very, very helpful. I would say absolutely essential to successful emergency response. So we have in our AIPs all the emergencies recorded, the organisational structure. This is all the fairly basic, obvious stuff, I guess. What are the roles and responsibilities? So in our case, we have, as shown in this diagram, for every terminal that you go to, you'd see the same process. A chief warden who's overall responsible for that site response and for the safety of the people on the site. He would also liaise with the emergency services, reporting to him or her. In fact, the emergency executive is someone who actually takes the burden off the chief warden by dealing with communications up and down the line and all the other things that the chief warden can't really be distracted by. A communications officer will typically support both the chief warden and the emergency executive, and the area warden will be a local person on the front line who actually makes sure people are taken out of danger zones and accounted for and so forth. So we have very clear roles and responsibilities in our ERPs, detailed response procedures for all the scenarios that we have identified, and then cooperation with the emergency services written through everything that we do. So I won't go through every part of this. I think some of it's self-explanatory, but I'll just pick out a few things that I think are key. The first one is it's amazing how ERP's procedures can grow and get complicated over years. In my view, they have to be as simple and as short as possible. Throw out anything that is not necessary for emergency response. So there's a lot of baggage that goes into these documents, and they need to be kept as short and meaningful as possible to what is needed to be known for emergency response only. Simple, but we sometimes get that wrong ourselves. Now, keeping things up to date, we need to update our ERPs on a regular basis. So whenever we modify facilities, whenever there's an incident or an exercise that we learn from, we review and revise the ERP so it's as good as it can be. But we need to try and do that relatively infrequently. We can't be changing that key document very frequently, because that just gets confusing to the people who have to use it. But the one thing in the document that we have to update almost continuously is the contact details. So that's very simple. You just have to have the right telephone numbers and the right names, both internally and externally. And so that's effectively a process of constant review and revision. Who's heard of the acronym PERL-BC? Does anyone know what that stands for? Nope. Okay, it's something our corporate guys have come up with. I think it's also commonplace in some of the emergency response organisations. It stands for, if I remember correctly, people, environment, assets, reputation, liability, and then business continuity. So those are our mantra sort of order of priorities for our emergency response plans. So it's absolutely key to be clear on what your priorities are, and as I said, everything else will follow. Clearly defined response organisation and structure and roles and responsibilities. Again, it's very straightforward, but again, it's easy to get wrong. In our plans, we have basically very clear duties of each of those members of the team that I just went through for what they do before an incident were to ever occur. So preparation responsibilities, what are their duties in the event of an emergency, and then what are their duties following an emergency. So a very clearly defined set of requirements to get you through both preparation, response, and then follow-up following an actual incident. Have to keep ERP copies available. If they're not immediately available to people on site, then you've got to ask, is it a meaningful document that could be used? And it's got to be there with some of the key emergency services and other parties as well. And then criteria. When do you actually have an incident that requires the activation of the ERP? Be clear about those activation criteria. When would you trigger it? When would you contact emergency services? What are the various criteria for triggering escalations and so forth? When do you notify the regulators? There are requirements in the regs for that, but you need to give your definition some sort of more detail and substance in your plans. I'll go through this one very briefly in the interest of time, just some more what I think are key requirements or basic sort of ingredients for success. I think they're all pretty self-explanatory. I'll pick out some. That list on the right is for us what we have as our basic menu of response procedures for our type of site, and some of them might be well known to you, some of them might not mean so much to your industry or your business, but in every single terminal there's the similar kind of requirements for generic procedures. So how do you activate the plan? What's your procedure for that? How do you raise the alarm? How's that going to work under the various different emergency scenarios or locations? How do you get people to simply stop work and muster in an appropriate way, in a controlled and safe fashion? And then how do you head count them so that you're accounting for all people safely? There's a procedure that goes into detail on exactly how to do that at each terminal, because that's, you know, when people are your priority, that's absolutely core to get that right. Access control, how do you stop third parties getting into the site when there's an emergency going on? Because people might typically be wanting to come in for all kinds of reasons. You have to prevent them from accessing the site, of course, and then how do you make free access available to the emergency services who you do not want to be stopping from getting in there? Log keeping, of course, vital that you have a good procedure for that, so that you have a good auditable audit trail of who did what when, what decisions were made, what information was passed on, and so forth, for learning, but also for if there is an inquiry or litigation process following. So getting records down, pretty key. See if there's any that I should give particular attention to. Define all your stakeholders. Templates, very useful to have clear templates for all of the different procedures. So recording information in standard forms so that people aren't left guessing as to how to write all that down in the heat of battle, so to speak. So just give them templates that they can work with for each of these types of activities. So how do you head count? How do you record that? How do you keep a log? How do you define your stakeholders? How do you identify who's who in the emergency response team at any particular point in time? So very simple templates for recording all that stuff. In our case, in LPG, because we're a very distributed business, we try to have the same templates everywhere, but we're moving towards electronic versions of those so we can share them to other parts of the business in case there's a guy who plays a key role who's actually at the other end of Australia. Identify all the equipment and informational documents that may be relied on during an emergency. So all the usual things like radios, alarms, PA systems, detectors, everything that is a key to emergency response. You need to commit that to paper in your emergency response plan, so you're very clear on what are the systems you could use and be needing to call on in an emergency. So that's part of your commitment, that those are the systems that you will maintain and make available to people to support the emergency response. All right. Now, the final part. Not sure how I'm doing for time. Is there a trapdoor that might open underneath me? Couple more minutes. Okay, so making the plans work in practice. So this is really the key part. Again, I apologise for all the words, but hopefully it's self-explanatory and you can read it later if you want. Again, you might know all of this, but this could be, if you like, a checklist to make sure you are ticking each of these things off in your own organisation to make sure that you've got effective preparation and response. So, making sure that the people in that team who have the emergency response roles absolutely know what they're going to do, what their roles and responsibilities are, that's core to success. So that's a number one ingredient. And they can follow those processes under highly stressed conditions. So it's relatively easy to follow a process when things are reasonably benign. The test is not can you do it under benign conditions, it's can you do it under very highly stressed conditions. And that imposes a lot of requirements for how you do your exercises and how often, and how you simulate those emergency scenarios. You've got to try and find a way to get people's blood pressure up, for want of a better word. Periodic training and exercises are absolutely key because fortunately we don't have too many emergencies on our sites. So the exercises are absolutely critical to keep it alive, keep people aware. It's very easy for businesses that are very busy, which I'm sure you're all familiar with that, to put these things to one side and to let it slip. The exercise is the thing that you can delay for a few months if you've got lots of things to do to keep customers or bosses happy. It's really not I think, a good direction to head in. You've got to be disciplined about when you do your exercises and how often and how you report them and so forth, so that you maintain that awareness of the risk in the business and don't let people become complacent. You rotate your scenarios. So as I said, we've got a range of emergency scenarios in our business. So each exercise might look at a different scenario, so you're not always trialing and testing the same thing. It's key in our business that if you have not played that role that you're assigned to in the emergency response team in an exercise, then you can't really play that role if the emergency actually occurs. So that's a standard that we are setting. You've got to be able to have at least done that role in an exercise, or you just can't play that role. Invite key stakeholders to participate, so the emergency services, some of your neighbours, a range of other people. You can invite them along and get them involved, and that also really helps with consultation. So backups, again, probably self-evident, but it's not easy to do that. You've got to have backups, and backups to the backups, really, for the way businesses operate. Certainly ours, we at any point in time may not have the key guy designated to a particular role available for whatever reason. He's on holiday, or she's off sick, or he's this, there, or everywhere. So having the backup to that key role and adequately, absolutely trained to the same standard as the designated role, that's vital. Extended emergency responses, that's the other reason for backup. So if you have an emergency that unfortunately goes on for 2 days or more, which is conceivable, then you have to rotate people in and out to give them a rest, and therefore your backup comes straight into play. Ensuring everyone else in the facility or visiting the facility understands the basics, again, fairly self-evident, but again, can be missed very easily. It's a key ingredient to success. So the guys who don't have a role in the emergency response team, but nevertheless need to do something very specific if an emergency occurs, so the visitors, the contractors, etc., they need to be clear on what are the basics. So you go through that with them in the induction process. And it's amazing how often in businesses I've worked in that we've missed that. And when the shit did hit the fan and someone was found to have not been inducted, all hell broke loose. That's, even if it made no difference, it's not great to be in that situation. The more frequently you exercise, the better. Absolutely key. Again, self-evident perhaps. Use desktops as well as live exercises. Use the desktops to effectively prepare for the exercise so you get the most out of it. The more often, the better. Some more ingredients. So performance standards. They're sort of the modern phenomenon, key performance indicators or expectations, we all need to have them. They can sometimes feel like they're the bane of my life, but you need to be able to define what makes a successful and healthy emergency response system in your organization. How do you measure the health of it? So come up with some basic things like, well, how often do we commit to doing our exercises per year? Are we tracking to that target? If we have an exercise, are we properly debriefing, writing recommendations that help improve and tracking those recommendations to closure? It's amazing how easily you just write it out, close it out and move on, when you really should be learning from it and tracking those actions, especially in our organisation, where every time we do an exercise in one terminal, other terminals could learn from that. So it's important to have standards and expectations on how you're going to run this whole thing. Another one that I alluded to earlier, if your training is not up to date, you cannot play that role. So that's a standard that you're setting that helps you to ensure effectiveness. Communications, absolutely vital, of course, in emergency response, so we're all aware of that. How you're perceived is absolutely dictated by how you communicate in this situation. So working in oil companies for a long time, it was very clear to me, ExxonMobil, one of my previous employers, how they were terrible at it a long time ago. They learned very quickly, of course, but the response to the Exxon Valdez incident in terms of corporate reaction and how the company presented just made things far, far worse than they needed to be. So oil companies have now learnt, that communication process and PR sort of approach is just as important in a way as the response on the ground. Regular communications with your neighbours and your emergency services, touched on that, before and during emergencies. And I guess this is an area where it's, for us, not natural, but it's absolutely vital, is sharing and consulting with our neighbours. What do we do? Why do you keep on hearing those strange noises from the other side of the fence? What's going on in our business? Sharing information with our neighbours, it's not something that comes naturally, but it's actually a helpful, useful thing to do as part of your preparation for an emergency if it ever were to occur. Then back to the last one about the equipment that you've committed to in your plan. Again, amazing how often you find the equipment that you needed isn't there, or it's there but it's broken, or it's there and working but the guy doesn't know how to use it. So that's where, again, that's an essential ingredient to successful response. That little picture on the side is really just a sort of sketch of some of the community information that we provide. We're required to do that as major hazard facilities, but I think it's good practice to do anyway. So just to wrap up, a whole range of references on this topic if you're interested. I'll say something, this is probably the only contentious thing I'm going to say. A lot of what I've been talking about is for major hazard facilities, and that's our, and process safety risk, and that's our background. But as I say, we've learnt the hard way in our industry, and a lot of effort has gone into this. So even if you're not a major hazard facility, even if you're not a process operator, I think you might learn or see a lot of value in the stuff that we've learned in our industry, and you could find that it helps you to improve your standards in your industry. So have a look at what the major hazard facility requirements are for emergency response plans under the work health and safety regs. Even if you're not an MHF, it's good practice for any type of facility. So a range of other sources of information if you're interested, and I hope I have increased rather than decreased your interest in this topic through that. So thank you very much. Any questions?
I'm not sure many people here understand what a levy actually means. Could you tell me what the safe distance away from a levy from one of the tankers that comes into the port is?
As far as you can get.
I had a skipper that had one years travel, so he said 90 miles.
That's a little bit over the top. So there's a lot of factors, but our kind of ranges are, depending on the size of the tank, 100 to 500 metres for injury effects. So because you have to err on the side of precaution, we might be saying or agreeing with the emergency services something like 1 kilometre for the worst case type scenario. But it's actually the emergency services who make that call. We provide our views and our sort of advice, but it's an emergency services decision to set that safe distance. 90 miles is too far.